All right, so we all know Apple's M-series chips today. They're an absolute marvel of engineering, completely dominating the industry. But, this incredible success, it was actually born from the ashes of a spectacular failure. So let's dive into that story. The story of Apple's first big, ambitious, and ultimately doomed attempt to control its own silicon, the PowerPC.
Okay, so this whole thing kicks off with one of the absolute strangest alliances in the history of tech. I'm talking Apple, IBM, and Motorola. And you have to understand, these companies were not friends. I mean, Apple's ads had been famously making fun of IBM for years. And yet, here they were, joining forces to take on a common enemy.
And the ambition here? I mean, it was completely off the charts. At the big announcement, IBM's president gets up and promises nothing less than a renaissance. So you see, they weren't just trying to make a faster chip. In their minds, they were literally creating the future of personal computing. Think about it. They had the talent, they had the money, they had the technology. So how did this dream team, a team that looked like it was ready to topple a giant, end in such a messy divorce just a decade later? Well, that is the big question we're going to try and answer today. All right, to really understand why this alliance was even necessary, we've got to rewind the clock. Let's go back to the tech battlefield of the early 90s. And, that battlefield was pretty much completely dominated by one company, Intel. You see, Apple was in a really tough spot. Their Macs were running on Motorola's 6800 series chips. And look, those chips were revolutionary for their time, but by now, they were just getting smoked by Intel's processors. This created what everyone called the Wintel juggernaut. Microsoft Windows running on Intel hardware. And that combination was spawning all these powerful super clones that were a huge threat to Apple's high-end market. And this really shows you the sheer scale of the problem. I mean, look at this. Intel's ecosystem had a staggering 80% of the market. And Apple and Motorola combined, a measly 12%. They were losing, and they were losing badly. There was just no way they could fund a real challenger to Intel all on their own. They needed backup, big time. So, on paper, this alliance made perfect sense. You had Apple, who desperately needed a faster chip. You had IBM, who, okay, maybe not the best at mass production, but they had some of the most advanced chip designs on the planet. And then there was Motorola. And what did they do well? They knew how to make silicon in huge volumes. It was like the perfect combination. Of course, the competition, well, let's just say they were a little skeptical. The VP of Compaq, who was one of Intel's biggest partners, he did not mince words. The entire industry was watching, and honestly, a lot of them were betting on this whole thing to fail. The pressure was definitely on. And yet, against all those odds, they actually delivered. The first few years of the PowerPC project weren't just, promising. They were a massive, industry-shaking success. I mean, the speed of execution was just incredible. They basically took IBM's existing high-end power architecture, figured out how to adapt it for a regular consumer desktop, and shipped the very first chip, the PowerPC 601, in just 1 year. That is a truly remarkable achievement, especially when you're talking about three giant clashing corporate cultures trying to work together. And this chip, it was an absolute beast. When it launched, it wasn't just a little faster than Intel's brand new Pentium chip, it was provably faster. The alliance had delivered on its #1 promise, pure, raw speed. Yeah, it cost a bit more, but for professionals who needed that performance, it was a total game changer. And the market? Oh, the market responded. Apple sold 1 million of their new Power Macintosh computers in less than a year. 1 million! This wasn't some niche product. For Apple, which was really struggling financially at the time, this was an absolute lifeline. So as you can imagine, the confidence inside the alliance was just sky high. You had a Motorola VP coming out and declaring that computing was now a two-chip race. They really genuinely believed that they had broken the Wintel monopoly and built a true long-term competitor to Intel. But you know how these stories go. Just as quickly as it rose, the whole foundation of the alliance started to crack. A perfect storm of pressures, both from the outside and from within, started pulling these partners apart. Let's just look at the timeline for a second to see how fast everything unraveled. First, 1995. Microsoft launches Windows 95, and it's a massive hit, making Microsoft even more dominant. Then Apple's own next-gen OS, a project called Copeland, completely collapses in on itself. And then, the biggest earthquake of them all. Steve Jobs returns to Apple. And one of the very first things he does? He kills the Mac clone program. So why would he do that?
Well, the clone program basically let other companies make computers that could run the Mac OS. For Steve Jobs, these clones were poison, absolute poison. They were selling cheaper machines, they were stealing Apple sales, and they threatened the one thing he cared about most, that tight integration of hardware and software. He wanted control back. But that one decision had a huge, and I mean huge, unforeseen consequence for the alliance. Why? Because Motorola and IBM had been counting on those clones to grow the market for PowerPC chips. With the clones gone, Apple was pretty much the only major customer left. This quote from a Motorola exec just says it all. The trust was completely broken. To them, Apple wasn't a partner anymore. They were just another customer.
So, with the partnership basically in shambles, the alliance kind of stumbled forward. But pretty soon, they were about to hit a technical wall. A wall so big that not even Steve Jobs' legendary salesmanship could get them over it.
So picture this. It's Apple's developer conference in 2003. Steve Jobs is on stage, and he makes this incredibly bold promise. He says that with the new G5 chip from IBM, they're going to hit a blistering 3 gigahertz clock speed within just 1 year. He was basically betting the entire future of the Mac on that promise.
Okay, fast forward 1 year. Jobs is back on that same stage, basically eating his words. They never got to 3 gigahertz. What happened was, as the chips got smaller, down to what's called the 90 nanometer process, they just started generating a ton of heat. I mean, so much heat you just couldn't cool them down effectively. Now, this was a problem for desktops, sure, but for laptops? It was what Tim Cook later called the mother of all thermal challenges. The dream of a fast, cool-running PowerPC laptop was dead. And so, in 2005, Steve Jobs did what everyone thought was unthinkable. He stood on stage and announced Apple was switching to Intel processors. The Great Alliance was officially over. So after all that, what are the big lessons we can take away from this epic failure? Well, when you really boil it down, the failure came down to a few key things. First, the partners' goals just diverged. IBM and Motorola started having way more success putting PowerPC chips into game consoles, like the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. But Apple desperately needed a chip for laptops. Then there was that thermal wall we talked about. That was a complete technical dead end. And finally, at the end of the day, Apple's tiny market share just wasn't big enough to pay for the massive R&D needed to even try and keep up with a giant like Intel.
And all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question. You see, the failure of PowerPC taught Apple a brutal, brutal lesson. You simply cannot depend on partners whose goals don't perfectly align with yours. It was that painful, messy divorce that planted the seed for Apple to one day, to control its own destiny completely. So you have to wonder, was this spectacular failure the necessary price Apple had to pay for the incredible success of Apple Silicon that we see today?